Hello, everyone. Please join me in welcoming filmmaker Johanna Hamilton. Journalist and author Betty Medsger. Betty, I know that, Betty Medsger. So sorry, Betty Medsger. And unindicted felons, Rains and John Rains. I just want to read a short passage, very short, from Bonnie's wonderful book. Betty's wonderful book. Sorry. Betty's wonderful book, sorry, which describes the importance of the media burglary this way. This historic act of resistance, perhaps the most powerful act of nonviolent resistance in American history, ignited the first public debate on the proper role of intelligence agencies in a democratic society. Perceptions of the Bureau evolved from adulation to criticism and then to a consensus that the FBI and other intelligence agencies must never again be permitted to be lawless and unaccountable. By 1975, the revelations led to the first congressional investigations of the FBI and other intelligence agencies, and then to the establishment of congressional oversight of these agencies. One of the other great successes about the burglary that's not captured in that sort of beautiful little summation of how important the burglary was is the remarkable success that the burglars weren't caught. And this is partly because of the vow of absolute confidentiality and silence that they took to one another. Almost. Well, and that's what I'd like to ask. How come we're sitting here? The burglars had committed themselves never to talk about this, never to try to contact one another, never to speak publicly about what they had done. And in fact, that was such a key to success because the FBI assumed that anybody who would do something like this would do what we would all do, which would be brag about it. But they never did, and so they were never caught. So how come we're here today, Betty?
Well, they had amazing egos. I think that they did not feel the need to brag, and I find that amazing when you think of people in all kinds of movements and tendencies to want to take credit for things. And after a certain length of time, as the spirit of reform was carried out and the Church Commission findings were held and then Congress established oversight, you could see that there was a lot that they might have wanted to brag about, but they didn't. And they kept that vow. And then one night, many years later, I was visiting Philadelphia for the first time in many years. I'd been a reporter in Philadelphia in the late 60s. And I had a trip to the Midwest and then to England, and in between I had a long weekend and I went to Philadelphia. And I filled my time with seeing old friends and acquaintances. And the first night, I was at John and Bonnie's house. And when I called and said I was in town, they said, why don't you come to dinner? And I had met them in the early 60s. We knew each other, liked each other, but we hadn't seen each other in a long time, probably more than a decade. And so when I went to the house, we had a lot to catch up on. We were talking about the recent years of our lives. And we went to the dinner table, and in the course of dinner, John and Bonnie's youngest child, whom I'd never met, Mary, came to the table to ask one of them a question, and John said, Mary, we want you to know, Betty, because many years ago, when your dad and mother had information about the FBI, and we wanted Americans to get it, we gave it to Betty. And
I thought I would have to pick up Betty from the floor. Loose tongues.
When I originally got the files in March of 1971, I really had no interest, a little curious about who did it. I just assumed, having come from that vast peace movement, covering that vast peace movement in Philadelphia, that it probably was someone from there. But my main concern at that time was the substance of the files and getting that out once we knew it was authentic, thanks to the FBI. And also, to what extent I could, was to protect them because I was concerned about there being fingerprints on the documents. But I never had any idea up until the second that John said that, who they were, and even then I found it extremely hard to believe.
And why did you say it? Why that night?
Loose tongues. I mean, I did not plan to have that happen. It happened, and then everything else happened.
Well, and everything else is a book and a movie. How did that process happen? How did you make the decision to participate? How did you, Johanna, sort of join this and work along with Betty and side by side, in parallel to tell the story in two different ways? And how did you gather all of the other participants and get their participation?
Well, Betty, being the wonderful journalist that she is, wanted to find out whether she could tell the whole story, the complete story, including trying to learn whether the other members of the group would come forward and tell their part of the story. And we agreed to try to help her contact those people and get going with all of the research that had to be done, going all the way back to the 1960s, and work on what we thought would be a pretty darn good book. And we knew she would do it very responsibly. And so we agreed to work with her over the next several years, and indeed some of the other members of the group agreed to have their identities revealed. One of the important ones, I think you know from the film, was Bill Davidan, and his health. He had Parkinson's, and his health was failing very rapidly, and we very much wanted to get the story told while he was still with us. That was an important factor too.
So Betty had embarked on the story many years before. I just consider myself to be very lucky to have known Betty for a decade, and Betty was researching her book during that time and writing it for much of that time, and so she shared the outlines of the story with me, and I thought it sounded absolutely fascinating. I mean, this is a period in history which has fascinated me personally since I was a teenager, so I was completely enthralled. And then there came a point about 4.5 years ago where it became clear that perhaps they were amenable to going on camera, and so Betty introduced me to them. I went down to meet with John and Bonnie and Keith and Bill and David Carey's, and then a few days later they phoned me to say that they were.
It's amazing. In the book, there's a wedding photo. Is in the book, and the photo has this caption. It says, "Bonnie and John Raines decided shortly after they were married in 1962 that they would risk their freedom in order to oppose injustice." What does that mean? What was that journey like for each of you individually and together, before the burglary and after the burglary?
Well, both of us. We were both parents. As you know from the documentary, we had 3 children under 10 in 1971. And we have been asked that question, Larry, again and again. How could you possibly put those children at risk? And that's a very good question. It's a tough question. It faces not just us, but everybody. Because it seems to me the truth is that you don't stop being a citizen when you start being a parent. In fact, in some sense, your obligations as a citizen even increase. Because there's many gifts you hope you can give your child. Good education if you got some money. A loving family, if you're lucky. But what you give them that will affect their lives more than any other single thing is the greatest legacy you give them is the nation that you put into their hands. So I don't think there's a difference between taking the risk that we took, because we didn't want to take that risk. We didn't, we weren't into this hero stuff. Certainly not into the martyrdom stuff. We would not have to do what we had to do if the people in Washington did what they were supposed to do. It was very clear to us that unless we did it, it wouldn't be done. So we did it.
Well, our marriage had been a wonderful partnership, in my opinion, of family life and work. and also activism in the public arena, starting with the civil rights activities that we participated in together, and then moving into the anti-war activities. And I had also been a teacher in New York City in East Harlem, and I think my consciousness was raised in another way about the inequality and unfairness of things in this country. I was teaching children who were mostly Puerto Rican immigrants. So I think it was a gradual coming to a realization that we couldn't just simply have a private, comfortable life, that we needed to be much more active in social change and demanding accountability from our so-called elected officials.
Betty, you were a reporter for the Washington Post at the time, and a religion reporter, not reporting on politics, but reporting on religion, but the two were closely connected at that time. There's a wonderful bit in your book where you describe the little offices that you shared, and your managing editor called your team SMERSH, which stood for Science, Medicine, Education, Religion, and all that shit. So how does a religion reporter become the recipient of stolen FBI files? How were you connected with sort of the political activism that was happening at the time?
Well, it does seem like an unusual journalistic route into writing about this. First, it was very hard to cover religion in the late 1960s and the early 1970s without also covering the peace movement. For one thing, there were many people, leaders from each of the major faiths, who were deeply involved in the peace movement: rabbis, priests, Protestant ministers. So I met many people from the peace movement through that coverage. But in the particular cases, we come closer to this situation. The case I had met John because John was a professor at what was a relatively new Department of Religion at Temple, an innovative place that had many exciting lectures, guests from the outside, as well as exciting people like John in the department. And as a reporter, I went there occasionally, and that's really how I met John and then Bonnie.
And John, what about the interaction between religion, faith, and activism in your life, and the life of the movement?
Well, I am an ordained Methodist minister, and I spent my adult life as a teacher. I really found out how important religion is and how effective religion can be to challenge authority. There are not too many institutions of authority. Government likes to think of itself as one. Religion likes to think of itself as one. There would have been no civil rights movement without the black church. That's very clear to me. And that became clear to me through the 60s as I was down there. There would not have been 67 votes to stop the filibuster in 1964 without the progressive white churches and synagogues up north. Lyndon Johnson was an excellent power broker, but it was not at all clear that he was going to get the votes he needed to get that filibuster ended. It was the pressure of the progressive churches and synagogues up north that, in the swing states especially, finally got him the votes he needed. That's history. That really happened. And what happened back then still needs to happen today, and maybe can happen.
You say something remarkable in the film about that sort of touches on the chilling effect of the surveillance that was happening of the political communities. And I'd sort of like to ask all of you to talk a little bit about fear as as the environmental ethos of the time, but then it's opposite, which is courage, and how those two forces sort of shaped the events that happened in this film and shaped the time.
Well, we realized that intimidation was a very powerful weapon to try to squash dissent, and it could make you afraid that if you didn't know who might be informing on you or what kind of charges could be brought against you, the powers that be at that time in Washington could punish people like ourselves, if they, and they did in some cases. But we also had a sense that, I guess you could say rage. I did, I'll speak for myself. I had a sense of rage about what was happening with the war. The war was escalating, and our country was lying to us about that war. And I think some of us just realized that we needed to act in the most responsible way we could as citizens and question authority and bring truth to light, which is one of the things you have to do when democracy is threatened. And that's how it felt to us at that time, that there were major threats to our democratic rights and our nation. Did I answer that question?
I would just like to describe some of the information that produced rage once it emerged. We know that what they did was incredibly courageous and that they found some important information, and oftentimes in the discussion we lose sight of the specifics, and I thought about that tonight with Senator Hart, who struck me afresh for some reason tonight when he said, right there they were in the middle of the time when the information was getting out, and nevertheless he says to Fritz Schwartz, how are we going to convince the American people that this is happening and that it should never happen again? So it's interesting to realize that even in that informed, relatively much more informed time than now, that was a keen interest. And I'd just like to mention what some of the things were. First, there was that policy statement about enhanced paranoia and make people think there's an FBI agent behind every mailbox. But then, as the information came pouring out, once the secret FBI opened, through various means, including beginning with the media files, and then the congressional hearings, and then in 1974, Congress strengthening the Freedom of Information Act so that people, anybody, but especially journalists and scholars, filed, and we learned the history of the FBI gradually. And there were outrageous things that we didn't know, including the fact that during the worst days of the Cold War, thousands of teachers and federal workers and also state workers and teachers even in high schools, not just colleges, were fired because of FBI informers who, following Hoover's pattern and belief, deemed people subversive, and they had no access to the accusations or even the people making the accusations against them. I think it's important to know that that happened. But also, specific outrageous acts, such as the one about Martin Luther King, a very long campaign against him, and the most outrageous being the effort to try to get him, to convince him to commit suicide. But there were also such things as the FBI agents under Hoover's orders, working with informants to get informants to testify falsely, even to convince jurors that, in the case of Geronimo Pratt in Los Angeles, that he had murdered someone whom he had not murdered, which a judge declared a few years ago. But he spent 27 years in prison because of that FBI informer's testimony. And another example that some of you may be familiar with, the informer who set up the murder of Fred Hampton, the Black Panther in Chicago. So there are countless individual outrageous examples of this. But then there's the general surveillance that also was not known. And I speak of that in two types. First of all, the black community. Throughout everything we came to know, there was nothing quite so massive or terrible as what was done to African Americans. And in the media files, it described the kind of any place that an African American person might go, down the street, to the store, to their library, to their classrooms, just anywhere they might be informed on. And it was described who should be hired as informers, anybody who had occasion to come into the black community. And then there was a requirement that was described in the media files that every FBI agent was supposed to hire at least one informer to report to him regularly on activities of black people, except in Washington, where every FBI agent was supposed to hire 6 informers who reported to him on a regular basis on the activities of black people. It really was a massive kind of thing. And then at the highest levels, it involved Hoover convincing successive presidents that they should ignore the push for civil rights because it was influenced by communists.
Johnny, do you want to say anything about that?
Well, I was actually going to say something about the flip side, because I didn't live through that era. But because Betty doesn't talk about this, and I think it's important, because I think there's an important journalism story in here too. I mean, obviously that you saw, but so when Betty receives these documents, I mean, it's obviously precedent setting in that the Post decides to publish them, and that's extraordinary. But Betty is the recipient of these government documents, stolen government documents, and she decides, basically in her head, I mean, aside from authenticating them, she decides in her head that, you know, this information, you know, along with Ben Bradley, that this information is you know, we need to publish the public's right to know. Had she been subpoenaed at the time, which was a favorite tactic of the government, to convene a grand jury, and had Betty been subpoenaed to, you know, reveal her sources, which obviously she didn't know, but still, Betty had decided that she would not cooperate. So I think there's the sort of flip side of the fear here. I think there's a great story of courage all round here. That, and I think Betty, I mean, everybody's very understated. The burglars are very matter of fact, and Betty is equally so, I feel. So it's
Absolutely.
an important thing to
No, I think, and it's worth pointing out, it mentioned in the movie, but really worth pointing out when you talk about fear and censorship and self-censorship. These documents were sent to the 3 major newspapers, the New York Times, the LA Times, and the Washington Post, and only the Washington Post published them. In fact, J. Edgar Hoover was leaning on the Justice Department to draft and quickly pass a sort of an official secrets act that would prohibit the publication of these documents. So there was enormous pressure that was being brought on all of the media organizations.
And if, and if Betty had refused to cooperate with that grand jury, she would have been held in contempt and gone to jail.
So why did Washington Post do this?
2 people, mainly, I think that the 2 editors involved played a fundamental role. Ben Bradley and Ben Medsger. From the beginning, 2 editors were crucial. Catherine Graham did not want to publish, nor did the legal counsel for the paper want to publish. He advised against it. It's important when considering that fear that to realize that a journalist has never received never received secret government files from sources who had stolen them from the government before, not your traditional whistleblower situation. So there's that, but there's also the fact that this was the first time that she or any other publisher had been demanded by the Nixon administration to suppress a story. So those are two pretty heavy things facing her that day. And the editors pushed from the beginning, said this is extremely important information about this very powerful institution that Americans need to know. And at the same time, John Mitchell, the Attorney General, that I'm sure many of you remember, was calling the 2 editors and Catherine Graham repeatedly through the afternoon, demanding that they not publish and saying that it would endanger national security and lives. It was clear from the files that that wasn't the case. But it took until 10 o'clock that night. When I came out at 6 o'clock and had finished writing my story, I learned for the first time that it might not run. But by 10 o'clock that night, she did make the decision to run it, and it ran on the front page and was distributed throughout the country on the Post wire.
But she went against the advice of legal counsel.
She
the lawyer at the Post advised her not to do it. And
That's right. It should also be noted that the legal counsel, the in-house legal counsel, also felt that way in the initial discussions about the Pentagon Papers. I mean, these were not, real
Easy
clear,
discussions.
easy things. Reporters and editors had very strong convictions about, yes, this is important public information, but it wasn't easy at the highest levels.
I should say that Betty has to run to the airport to catch a cab to the airport. So just join me in thanking her. Thank you, Betty. continue the conversation about publishing forbidden fruit, because there's an amazing sort of history repeating itself even as this film is being made. Johanna, you're good friends with...
Betty, enjoy Paris.
Oh my gosh.
Thanks.
She's going to hug her way out.
That's good, as she should. Thank you, Betty. Johanna, you're good friends with Laura
Yes.
Poitras,
Yes.
and she, as you many saw, is an executive producer of this film. And I know she's a friend. Talk about her involvement in the film and your discovery in the course of making this film that she was in the middle of what's probably the biggest drama surrounding stolen documents and runaway government surveillance since media.
So Laura Poitras has been a friend and a colleague for many years, and when I knew that John and Bonnie and the Burglars were going to talk to me, she was one of the first people that I turned to, and she was one of the few people who knew, sort of my generation, who knew about the media break-in. I mean, not a whole lot of people who knew about it. And at that time, she was already busy working on a film about contemporary surveillance, which I knew and she had shared, but she was sharing very little with very few people. But I knew that real broad brushstrokes, enough to know that she was could be of help, and she was. We encrypted our drives through with her knowledge, just in case we had any visits. She was a sort of continual source of advice and an ear throughout, many years of the production. And then there came a point where it became impossible, or she was advised really to no longer work in the United States because her level of harassment was just so bad when she was entering and exiting the country. So she went to live in Berlin, and we to edit the film that she's currently making. So we were in touch much more sporadically. But then there came a point about a year ago where she emailed me, and it had been a while since we'd been in touch, and she emailed me and just said, "Listen, I'm just thinking about you, and I'm thinking about your film, and just let me know if there's anything I can do to help." And I was like, "That's really nice of her." And then a few months later, I found out about Edward Snowden along with everybody else. And sort of chronologically in my mind went back, and that was probably where she was. I mean, I believe Snowden had contacted her probably in January, but in March was probably when they were already getting to know each other online. So yes, and then I think there are great parallels between what she potentially faces right now and what Betty faced back in the day. I mean, when she and Glenn came back into the country just a couple of weeks ago, there were lawyers to meet them at the airport for precisely the same reasons, that perhaps they could be served with a subpoena while they were here. So yes, it did feel like real. The analog and digital versions playing out.
Well, and it sort of brings me to the kind of haunting part of the story for me, which, I find it mystifying in a way that we had this experience. It was a formative experience for me. I was, 10 years old, 12 years old, went on Catholic church-led anti-war marches. We had this experience of a whole generation that we knew that we were being lied to by the FBI, by the CIA, by the Pentagon, Watergate. How does that not leave a legacy of skepticism? The film, there's headline "Distrust Across the Land." How do we go from such disillusionment to such credulousness in a way in those 40 years? And for John and Bonnie, I wonder, when you sort of think about measure the accomplishment of your activism. Look at all the effects in your lifetime. How much has been gained? How much have we lost? Think about civil rights, the Supreme Court kind of gutting the Voting Rights Act and affirmative action. Surveillance, obviously, the NSA. Activism versus acquiescence. What's the scorecard in your minds?
Well, outrage leads to action only when you have hope of change. Outrage, when you don't have hope of change, leads to cynicism. So there's a quality of outrage at the end of the 60s amongst concerned citizens. And there's quality of outrage, I would think, today about the kind of surveillance that's going on and the reasons that certain people, powerful people, give for that. I think that I'm a teacher, and I teach undergraduates. On the surface, it seems like the students are cynical. But if you scratch that surface, you're going to find a boiling outrage there. And somewhere along the line, there's going to be a match that lights the fire. And when that happens, big change will happen. So I don't think we're a nation of cynics. I think we're a nation waiting to blow the roof off of those who want to take the nation away from us, including 5 members of the Supreme Court.
I don't see widespread cynicism either. We now have 7 grandchildren, and they continue to be concerned and want to be knowledgeable about what's happening to their environment, to their planet, for one thing. That's very different than it was in our day. And I think that one of the things that young people today are yearning for, that we had and probably even took it for granted in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, we had a community, a very solid community of people with shared values who were determined to make a difference, to make a change. And I think young people today are more isolated, and that's too bad. I think they have a sense of that, and they're yearning for a community to be part of. But it's very hard in our age, when they're all on their devices, to other than communities that are online, to seek others that you can then plan to become active with, who will watch your back and protect you, and that you know you can trust. And I'm hoping very much that will develop again for my grandchildren's generation, because I think there's a yearning for it.
I mean, my very strong desire is that the film has a cross-generational appeal. I really hope that it does, and obviously with thanks to Laura and Edward Snowden, hopefully it will. I mean, I do feel like Laura's film and this film can perhaps be in dialogue with one another when it comes out. That's a little down the line, but in the interim, certainly in the next 6 months, hopefully we can insert ourselves into the national dialogue, this discussion that we're having now finally after so many years. And I think in a very safe way, thanks to these people. They are, Keith has said it a number of times, it's much easier to view this group of people no longer as radicals, because that was 40 years ago. And Jon Stewart, on the day after Betty's book, a couple of days after Betty's book came out, Jon Stewart did a fantastic piece on his show, talking about Edward Snowden, and then cutting to the announcement that they had revealed themselves, and he said, now we know how long it takes to go from traitor to hero. So, I mean, hopefully it's not going to be 40 years before at least what he's revealed is recognized to not be, endangering national security. But I do think there is a fear that people can throw up their hands and think, there's nothing I can do. And I hope that we, certainly we plan an impact and engagement campaign with the film, working with, all the biggest organizations, nonprofits that are working on civil liberties, privacy, surveillance issues, certainly to get it out there as best we can. But hopefully, again, the cross-generational appeal. I know certainly for the people who are following us on Twitter, we do have a broad appeal, and I hope that continues. The online generation managed to stop. The SOPA, PIPA audiences did manage to have an effect, and hopefully we'll see that going forward. There is this, the USA Freedom Bill, which is working its way through Congress right now. It's a bipartisan, bicameral effort. Shows some hope, at least.
I have one last question for John and Bonnie, and Johanna, I don't know if this is a question that you might have asked any of the other participants, but it's one that I started thinking about as soon as I started reading the book. And then I think we have time for a couple of quick questions from the audience. But what, in all those years since media, what is the one caper that crossed your mind that you would have liked to do, or you were hoping that somebody would do? What's the next? I mean, what is the one that we should be thinking about?
Let's see.
There are so many. There are so many.
We can take some questions, but that's a question I think we should all take with us. because there's work to be done, and this was such a brilliant blow, such a brilliant specific blow, and it's beautiful, it's effective, it was nonviolent,
Right, exactly.
amazing.
I have a question for Joanna. Where did you get that footage of the people down in Powelton Village where they were having
The street fair?
What a
the
great scene.
FBI and the street fair?
Uh-huh.
That was the most amazing image.
That came, I forget, with CBS or ABC News, but they who came and filmed it at the time, but it's actually held now at Temple, at the university where John teaches. They sort of hold all the local archives there. And so my associate producer spent days and days in the basement of this place. And when she found that particular piece of footage, I remember the day we were all like, yahoo! We knew it existed,
My
but...
sister was at Penn at the time, and I was looking for her while I was watching.
Oh,
it.
wow.
So
Wow.
amazing.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yes.
I had a question about a scene that takes place in the book that isn't in the film.
There are
when the
many.
FBI, yes, many, yes. When the FBI comes to your house, and John and Ron, and John, you take this it's a great scene because you kind of are coming home from playing tennis or something, you go upstairs and take a shower and you decide, how are you going to talk to these FBI agents? And you take this kind of antagonistic tone with them, like, well, I do agree with those burglars, and then it goes on, and then of course, Bonnie comes home just a few minutes after they left, and they would have recognized her, so it's very dramatic. But then also after the Camden acquittals, there's a great part where Betty describes how you kind of have this fantasy of being on trial yourself, being able to present to the public your case. And I just kind of have been wondering, after reading the book, if you feel both of you feel a sense of relief now, if you feel that same sense of now being out in the open with your story.
Well, certainly I didn't have a fantasy about going public in the first 5 years after the robbery. I wasn't stupid, and I wasn't masochistic. And I didn't need to be a hero. That's very important. None of us needed to be a hero. We didn't think of ourselves that way. We did a certain act, got some information into hands that then had to do what they had to do, that is, newspaper people. And then once the newspaper people did what they had to do, then at last people in Congress and Senate began to do what they should have been doing before. So there was never any fantasy about trying to draw attention to ourselves. And that remains the case. I mean, okay, the lights are on right now. But one of the things you know when the lights come on is the lights will go off. And knowing that when the lights come on, that they will go off, helps you keep your feet on the ground.
In defense of that scene, which I really do regret, and there's so much that I couldn't put in the movie. I feel like the movie is really the cliff notes to the book. It was just a matter of who was telling which story, and it was a question of how many FBI encounters could we have in the film. And also, potentially, that one might have involved a recreation, and we simply didn't have the budget for it. Which I was very sad about.
2 more quick questions, I think, in front.
So you guys emailed several journalists, and luckily Betty was able to publish it with the Washington Post. Curious.
Pre-email.
Mail.
Yeah.
No email.
But I'm curious how, if she didn't publish it, if it wasn't published, how you would have gone about it. And nowadays, we have mechanisms like WikiLeaks and electronic submission. Does that make it easier or harder to process?
Oh, I think today would be much easier if Betty had been turned down by Catherine Green. Again, the question.
What would you, if Betty hadn't published?
Oh, yes. Already, Bill Davidoff was out there with the copies of these files, passing them out everywhere. So it would have gotten out one way or another. But it was very important that a national newspaper with credibility publish them, because then the Washington Post, once they did that, then the New York Times could editorial start, asking for Hoover's resignation and things like that. I think the way information gets out now, I mean, NSA would have loved to stop Snowden before that information got out. But once even a trickle of that motion got out, then So social media just went crazy, and you couldn't stop it.
Can I just add to that? What John says is right. Bill Davidoff was taking the documents everywhere, and he did send them to many other organizations very shortly thereafter, which is how the journalist whose door was broken down had them shortly after the break-in as well. But I do want to say I interviewed Daniel Ellsberg for this film, initially envisaging perhaps that he would be part of it. And he said that at that time, the New York Times, he'd already given the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times at the time of the media break-in. But the New York Times was holed up in a hotel room here in New York, working away, but hadn't told him that. He didn't know what they were doing with the Pentagon Papers. There was no information, no communication with them. And so he panicked a little bit. He was a little panicked. And when he saw what they did and how effective they were at getting their information out there, he then decided to send the Pentagon Papers to many other publications. And ultimately, if you remember, when it gets to the Supreme Court decision about the Pentagon Papers says that you cannot stop because basically by that time the train had left the station. There were so many publications that were ready to publish the Pentagon Papers that you just couldn't stop it. And it was so in tiny part thanks to these guys that happened that way. I do also just one tiny thing. We're on our website, the part of the sort of Take Action campaign is we're working with an organization called the Freedom of the Press Foundation that actually Laura and Glenn sit on, but we're working with them. They've developed this software, it's called Secure Drop, that an increasing number of news organizations are using, which is really the digital anonymous equivalent of what they did. It's a digital mailbox, which is anonymous in terms of the whistleblower and anonymous in terms of the journalist who receives it. It's anonymous at both ends, so it's really a leaking tool.
Do you have time for one more? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I assume the statute of limitations is operative here, but I was wondering if you had heard from the FBI or if they commented or made any statement about this. And also just quickly, if the film has been shown to young audiences, I'm curious about the reaction because I think it's a whole history that sadly people don't know. I mean, the young generation doesn't know it. It's so important.
We do plan to show it. This is just the beginning. This is like the 4th or 5th public screening that's ever been held of the film. Was showing it last week at the Tribeca Film Festival, and now we're starting the rollout. So we do plan that. Do you guys want to comment on it?
Well, one of the most gratifying results of this recent publicity and the story in the film are the young students who are contacting John and contacting me and Betty and others as part of an American history class in high school. And they want to interview us and get much more information about what happened then, how did it happen, and how does it relate to what the situation is currently. So I think we're very hopeful that we can use it as an educational tool and maybe even an organizing tool in the future. And we hope that the film will be seen by a broad spectrum of people in the American public.
And in terms of the FBI, the statute of limitations, the FBI had closed the case in '76 after the 5 years statute on burglary had run, and the statute also on theft of government property had run at that point. So any legitimate charges that they could have brought basically were gone. But we didn't know, Betty and I weren't 100% sure that they didn't have something in their back pocket that they didn't want to pull out. Even if it wasn't necessarily legitimate, it didn't necessarily mean that a prosecutor of the Department of Justice might decide to make a name for themselves. Even if ultimately the case failed, it could just generate a lot of fear. And so Betty and I operated on that principle, which is why we kept the story very quiet while we were working on it. We also sort of feared death by leaking. If the FBI leaks it anonymously, and the sort of drumbeat started that, an example should be made out of these people. This was also, parallel to this, Obama administration is prosecuting whistleblowers. So we sort of had that in the back of our minds all the time.
They did make one positive comment, though.
Yes, on January 7th, when the book came out, they did.
There was one comment from the FBI, something to the effect of, there really were some very positive outcomes and reforms and changes that took place as a result of that. So they had an opportunity to be hypercritical if they wanted to be and to bash us around a little bit, but that really did not happen.
It really was best case scenario. It's what we hoped for, and we hoped that they would say, that was then and this is now. But we didn't.
I think we should probably close it down. I'll take one more question in the back.
Would any of you like to comment on your colleague's observation about cynicism as an unintended consequence of the action?
John?
Well, I think the cynicism deepened because of Watergate and what we found out from Watergate, and also the Pentagon Papers. I don't think, see, cynicism doesn't create energy, it drains energy. And the nice thing about young people is they're young. And they like energy, they don't like cynicism and despair. And it's tough. How can I put this? We need government. I'm not a libertarian. We need government. And we need government to do what we need government to do. And that's to do things that we can't do as individuals. We have a terrible situation right now in terms of the underfunding of education. We're turning out, from places like Temple, we're turning out students after 4 years who have $28,000 or more dollars in debt. We're turning out a bunch of indentured servants. We've got infrastructure that's falling apart right here in New York, that's for sure. We've been bumping all over the place. I don't know how long your taxis last, maybe 2 weeks or something. But I mean, all over the country we've had public starvation of federal funds, of the various services that we need government to do. And I hope that we're getting tired of small expectations of our elected officials. I think that I'm hoping that we'll have some of that sense of outrage again, because this nation is going to hell. I mean, you know, it is. We all know that. We all know that. And we elect people to send them down to Washington to keep that from happening. Well, maybe we need to change some of those people we're sending down there. I mean, I'm thinking about this weather down south. You know, all those senators down there and all those representatives down there, they all say, oh no, there's no climate change, there's no climate change. Well, I'm thinking, you know, maybe they're going to hear a new message from the people out there whose houses are all blowing on down, one after the other. They might begin to say, hey, Mr. Senator, Mr. House Member, you've been saying there's no climate change or anything all these years. Don't you think maybe you should change your opinion, or maybe I'll have to change my vote? That message could be a powerful one.
By the way, the last Congress passed 58 bills for the lowest total in American history.
Yeah.
Nothing. Do nothing Congress.
Well, I think I also hear my youngest son, Nathan, talk about how every time there's an election, how he has to try to convince his friends and coworkers to vote. They don't think it matters. They don't think it makes any difference. Why bother? It's just all money in politics, which is true to a large extent. So they are cynical. I wish they would get busy working to get the money out of politics, and then their vote might actually, at some point again, be a precious thing and something that energizes them.
There's no substitute for what government alone can do. And we all depend and rightfully demand that government do what government is meant to do, because we can't do it in cities and in states and as just individual private citizens. I mean, this should be a nation of the people, by the people, and for the people. We all know that. And that news has to get down to Washington. Quit stealing the country from us. We send you there to serve us, not to become wealthy individuals in your own terms and part of the swinging doors once you're out of office into Wall Street, into oil companies and so on. I mean, yeah, let's get mad. We have every right to be mad. Every right to be mad.
That's perfect. Perfect note to end it on.